Today is January 13th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I want to talk about the situation developing around Soledar and Bakhmut. I also want to talk about the prospect of the West sending Western main battle tanks. So first of all, let's take a look at this liveuamap.com time lapse. This is from January 1st to today. And as you can see, Russian forces are making advances toward Soledar, just north of Bakhmut. Now keep this in mind, Bakhmut, Soledar, and to the north of that, Seversk, and then all the way down to the south, Avdiivka. This is a massive, major Ukrainian defense line that has been built up over the course of several years. And they are clinging to this defensive line because when they fall back, they will fall back to positions that are more difficult to defend. So they may be taking heavy losses now. They will take even more losses and suffer even more setbacks if they fall back. Now, this has been going on for a while, this fighting around Bakhmut. And when it seemed as if Ukraine was going to be able to hold on, and especially when we were listening about the Kherson and Kharkov offensives, this was the strategic city of Bakhmut. But now that it looks like Ukraine's grip on it is loosening, now the Western media, Western leaders, the Ukrainian leadership, they're all talking about how Bakhmut is meaningless. Soledar is meaningless. These are insignificant cities. Doesn't matter, even though we're obviously pouring some of our best troops and equipment into holding it for some reason, but it's not important. If we lose it, it's not important. And don't forget, the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, at least claims he visited Bakhmut recently. Why would you go take the risk or pretend to take the risk of visiting a frontline city if it's so meaningless? Why would you do that? So I think you could see how the narrative is shifting, and as it does, it contradicts what was previously being said. Let's take a look at this article from the Washington Post. It says, Russia claims to control Soledar, a battlefield gain after months in retreat. Let's see what this article says. It says, thousands of soldiers have died on each side fighting over Soledar Bakhmut in recent months, even though military experts say neither appears to be of tremendous strategic value. Capture in Bakhmut would mark a territorial advance for Russia toward other key Ukrainian cities in the eastern Donbass region, but experts have said it will be difficult for the Russian troops to push onward. What if Russian troops aren't really interested in pushing onward? Eventually, they want to secure the entire Donbass region. There is no doubt of that. But at the moment, they are focused on destroying Ukraine's military. That is their priority. Russian commanders have said that is their priority. They are grinding down Ukraine's forces. They are not seeking to take territory, to rush forward and snatch up huge tracts of territory. They want to draw in Ukrainian forces. They want to destroy them. And Ukraine is playing right into this strategy. They are pouring in some of their best troops and some of their best equipment to try to hold on to Bakhmut. Now, the Washington Post is talking about Russia retreating. And yes, they did. They retreated in Kharkov, and they retreated away from the city of Kherson to the east bank of the Dnieper River. They still hold a good percentage of Kherson Oblast, but they did leave the city, and they evacuated to the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. That is true. But if your goal is to destroy the Ukrainian military while preserving your fighting capacity, then that is exactly what you would do. And we have to remember that even according to the Western media, Ukraine suffered catastrophic losses in their offensives in Kharkov and also Kherson. We're talking multiple brigades, between 5 to 7, possibly even more, of trained manpower and also some of the best equipment that they had at the time. A lot of it is transferred over from the West after a lot of the equipment they began the conflict out with began disappearing. We're talking hundreds of tanks, hundreds of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, almost 2,000 artillery pieces, all disappearing off the battlefield. NATO scraped together every Soviet-era system they could find in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and they sent it to Ukraine, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. They scraped it together. They created these offensive forces, and they lost them. They took this territory, but they traded these forces for that territory. Russia withdrew, conserved their manpower and equipment. Their troops are still there. They just moved back. And Ukraine lost all of these troops. Now they need to rebuild their army. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But the Washington Post and others in the Western media, they are talking about victory measured in square kilometers taken. If Russia is fighting an attritional war, and if Ukraine is in an attritional war, even if they don't want to fight it like an attritional war, it is going to be measured in how much you lose versus how much you're taking off the battlefield regarding your enemy's forces. And it seems that Russia has the definitive edge in this regard. And so it doesn't really matter how much territory Ukraine takes. At the end of the day, if their army is gone, then Russia is going to be able to take all of this territory back. Remember, we were told during the Kherson and Kharkov offensives, this was a turning point. This is Russia withdrawing in disarray. This is Ukraine with the advantage, with the momentum. And they're going to keep pushing until Russian forces are off of Ukrainian territory, which Kiev claims includes the Donbass region and Crimea. Well, that is not happening now. Actually, now, despite measuring success in square kilometers, Ukraine is losing territory. The West is sending a huge amount of equipment to Ukraine now. This is a new wave of equipment that they are transferring. This is equipment that they have hesitated to send to Ukraine. And the reason they hesitated is because it is extremely inappropriate to send this equipment. They are sending U.S. Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. They are sending German Marder infantry fighting vehicles. The British are talking about sending 10 Challenger 2 main battle tanks. And Poland is talking about sending probably between 12 to 14 Leopard 2 tanks. This is a German-made modern main battle tank. They say they're sending a company of tanks. Well, a company is between 12 and 14 tanks normally. When you look at this, you see this wide variety of vehicles. Just what I mentioned, that is every single one of those uses different ammunition. They have completely different training requirements. You have to train a maintenance crew to maintain and fix each vehicle separately. The Challenger 2 is the British main battle tank, and it has a rifled main gun, which means the ammunition for the Challenger 2 is not interoperable with the Leopard 2 or the Abrams or any of the other main battle tanks. There's the standard for modern main battle tanks is a smoothbore gun. So theoretically, ammunition for an M1 Abrams and a Leopard 2 and maybe a French Leclerc, they could share the ammunition. They can just ship in the ammunition and divide it amongst all of these main battle tanks. But the Challenger 2 has a rifled gun, which means it requires its own special ammunition. So you can already see how the logistical sustainment and maintenance issues are building up, and also the training issues. You train a tank crew to operate a Leopard 2, then you have to retrain them again if you transfer them over to a Challenger 2. And you're going to have to train all of these different tank crews or raw recruits, train them into tank crews differently for each one of these vehicles that are being sent. And then firing a rifled main gun versus a smoothbore main gun. Two totally different things. And then another consideration is that Western main battle tanks, with very few exceptions, do not have autoloaders like Soviet and Russian main battle tanks, which means for every tank that you send Ukraine, if you have a tank crew ready to be trained, you have to add an additional man to each crew. So Soviet era and Russian main battle tanks have 3 crew members, a driver, a gunner, and a commander. For the Leopard 2 and the Challenger 2, you need to include a loader as well for crew members. Again, you can see all of these problems that are building up. Now, these numbers that we're looking at, 100 M113s, the US is sending 50 Bradleys, 40 or 50 mortars, so around 100 infantry fighting vehicles. You have 10 Challengers, 12 to 14 Leopard 2s. This is going to, and I've been listening to the Duran every single day. I highly recommend you listen to their updates. I will put the links to their main channel and their respective channels, Alex Christoforo and Alexander Mikuris. They have been talking about how the British and the Polish are beginning a process of pressuring other NATO members to also send main battle tanks. So this is just the first of many to come. This is what they're going to do. Now, to put these numbers in perspective, a US Armored Combat Brigade has 87 main battle tanks, M1A2 Abrams, 152 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 18 M109 self-propelled howitzers, which is interesting because the US sent exactly 18 M109s in the last package, or they will be sending them. 45 armed M113s, so the US sent double that number. So as you can see, depending on the vehicle, the weapon system, they're sending enough for maybe almost a brigade, not quite. Maybe some more shipments are going to be announced. And in some cases for 2 brigades. So they may have between 1 and 2 armored brigades. A single brigade is about 4,000. So we're talking about 8,000 troops altogether and all of this equipment, possibly. So what are they going to do? It's impossible for Ukraine to stand up entirely new brigades, because a brigade is not just finding 4,000 men and putting it on the equipment for a single brigade. It's not that simple. You have to have leadership and subunits within the brigade, and that leadership takes years to develop. So what they're going to do is either scrape together existing brigades into 1 or 2 new brigades, and that will be the easiest way to sustain all of these vehicles. They're going to have spare parts, fuel, ammunition that needs to be constantly shipped to the front line. It'll be much easier if these vehicles are concentrated in a very small number of units rather than spreading them across several brigades. The more variety they introduce, the bigger the logistical hurdles are that Ukraine is going to have to cross over just to sustain these things on the battlefield. And I want to remind you, so we're talking about 1 or 2 brigades. Ukraine has lost anywhere between 5 to 7 or possibly more brigades in their Kherson and Kharkov offensive. Now, I hear people already saying, well, it doesn't matter because Western main battle tanks are invincible, they are wonder weapons, they are going to provide Ukraine the knockout punch to finally end this conflict once and for all. And this is not true, not even close, and I'm going to get into all of the problems with Western main battle tanks here in just a moment, and I've already covered the limitations, the serious limitations of the Bradley, the M113, in previous videos, but I want to talk about what Russia has done since they've destroyed multiple brigades of Ukrainian forces in the Kherson and Kharkov offensives. Since then, what have they done? They have mobilized 300,000 reservists with previous military training. They have been retrained, a lot of them already deployed to the theater of operation. They have also started building these extensive defensive fortifications. So this is from the New York Times. Russia is building a vast network of trenches, traps, and obstacles to slow Ukraine's momentum. Will it work? Well, what momentum? They're losing ground around Bakhmut. They're about to lose Soledar as I record this video. Their momentum is gone. They are being pushed back once again. They have to regain their momentum, if they can regain their momentum. So Russia has 300,000 additional troops mobilized. They're building this extensive defensive network, obstacles, and we've also watched brand new weapon systems being delivered to the battlefields. Over 200 T-90 Prorив That means breakthrough Russian main battle tanks. The latest, most modern Russian battle tank in operation on the battlefield is the T-90 Proryev. They have modernized T-72s, brand new, restored, arriving on the battlefield, and modernized T-80s, also arriving in large numbers on the battlefield. And these are all main battle tanks Russia has a lot of experience operating, huge networks for logistics, ammunition, and maintenance. So they don't have these problems that Ukraine does. And also, when any of these Western main battle tanks or Bradleys or M113s break down, if the optics, the electronics, the fire control goes down, they have to be sent 1,000 kilometers from the front line to Poland to be repaired in maintenance facilities there. Because if any maintenance facility is opened up in Ukraine, Russia will find it, target it with cruise missiles, and destroy it. Russia, on the other hand, all they have to do is place their maintenance facilities outside of the range of HIMARS, and that's how far they have to go to send their broken vehicles. I will talk about the Challenger 2 in just a moment, but let's start with the Leopard 2. The Leopard 2 is going to be sent in the largest quantities, most likely. They're the most widely available and the most appropriate of the Western main battle tanks to send to Ukraine. It has a diesel engine, not a turbine engine like the M1 Abrams that the US uses, which consumes huge amounts of fuel. It's heavy. People say, well, the T-80 has a turbine engine. It's not as heavy, so it's not going to be using as much fuel. And Russia has T-80s and T-72s, so they can pick whichever one they think is most appropriate for the operation. If you send an M1 Abrams, it's going to require huge amounts of fuel that are going to tax Ukraine's already heavily burdened logistics. So the Leopard 2 is the most likely candidate that will be sent in the largest numbers. Many NATO members have Leopard 2s, including Turkey. So let's look at this national interest article from 2019. It's titled, "Turkey's Leopard 2 tanks are getting crushed in Syria." That doesn't sound like good news for Ukrainians who are going to be operating Leopard 2s on the battlefield, or possibly Polish volunteers. We see these Western volunteers or mercenaries, whatever you want to call them, on the ground in Ukraine. They're usually operating small arms, and they're outgunned, and they're usually running in the opposite direction of Russian gunfire in the woods somewhere. So I bet there are a lot of these groups of Westerners fighting in Ukraine who would really like to get their hands on some tanks that they may have previously operated when they were serving in their own respective national armed forces. So this national interest article says, numerous Leopard 2s have been destroyed in intense fighting over ISIS-held Al-Bab, a fight that Turkish military leaders described as a trauma, according to Der Spiegel. A document published online listed ISIS as apparently having destroyed 10 of the supposedly invincible Leopard 2s, 5 reportedly by anti-tank missiles, 2 by mines or IEDs, 1 to rocket or mortar fire, and the others to more ambiguous causes. These photos confirm the destruction of at least 8. One shows a Leopard 2 apparently knocked out by a suicide vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, an armored kamikaze truck packed with explosives. Another had its turret blown clean off. Remember all of these stories across the Western media about Russian tanks with their turrets blown off, and how this was supposed to be a major humiliation for Russian forces. It turns out this is something that can happen to a Western main battle tank, like the Leopard 2. 3 Leopard wrecks can be seen around the same hospital near Al-Bab, along with several other Turkish armored vehicles. It appears the vehicles were mostly struck, the most lightly protected belly and side armor by IEDs and AT-7 and AT-5 anti-tank missiles. And some of these anti-tank missiles are produced by Russia, and I'll get into that a little bit more here in just a moment. So it's obvious that Leopard 2 main battle tanks are not invincible. They are very vulnerable on the battlefield, especially when they are not used as part of a combined arms force. Turkish main battle tanks, though, were. They were supported by infantry fighting vehicles. Turkey has an air force. They had air power that could provide cover for these armored vehicles, and yet this still happened to them. We can only imagine what Russian forces are going to do to these Leopard 2 tanks when they show up on the battlefield. And actually, we really don't have to imagine, because Russian forces have already destroyed hundreds and hundreds of Ukrainian tanks and other tanks donated by NATO members to Ukraine over the last almost year of fighting now. They're going to do the exact same thing to any Leopard 2s that show up on the battlefield. And NATO is sending Western main battle tanks now specifically because Russia has done such a thorough job destroying all of these Soviet-era main battle tanks that have already been transferred over to Ukraine. Now, what about the Challenger 2? This is from 2007. MOD kept failure of best tank quiet. And the Challenger 2 is highly vaunted. It is legendary. But maybe that's, well, let's find out why it might be so vaunted and yet it failed. Let's read on about this. One of the British Army's Challenger 2 tanks was pierced by an Iraqi insurgent missile more than 8 months earlier than the government has previously admitted. The Ministry of Defense had claimed that an attack last month that breached a tank's armor was the first of its kind in 4 years of war in Iraq. But another Challenger 2 was pierced by a powerful rocket-propelled grenade in August last year during an attack that blew off part of a soldier's foot and injured several others. And then it says, the Challenger 2 is reputed to be one of the most sophisticated tanks in the world, and those used in Iraq by the British Army are built with Dorchester armor, the composition of which is top secret. The tank is also fitted with explosive reactive armor at its front that should deflect any weapon fired at its hull. The MOD has finally confirmed that the tank's armor was breached last August and has said that an investigation was conducted to discover why the explosive reactive armor appears to have failed. However, the department refused to comment on its findings, citing security reasons. So the Challenger 2, the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, they are vaunted, they are legendary because of propaganda. It is war propaganda to build up their reputation so that the enemy fears them more when they meet them on the battlefield. But if you have a trained and disciplined army, they are more than capable of destroying these tanks. They are far from invincible. And it's important to take note of this story about the Challenger 2, because I've heard people say, oh, well, M1 Abrams being destroyed in Yemen, I'm going to get to that in just a moment here, because the U.S. exports a downgraded version of the M1 Abrams. It's not the M1 Abrams the U.S. operates, so that's why we see them being lost in large numbers in Yemen. Well, let me dispel that with this CBS News article right here from 2007. U.S. tank hit, 2 GIs dead in Iraq. 2 American soldiers were killed when their Abrams battle tank was damaged by resistance fighters. The tank was disabled when it was struck by a landmine or roadside bomb. And I'm thinking that Russia has a lot of mines they could probably use against any Western main battle tank and many other weapons as well. And so we're talking about M1 Abrams. Possibly the U.S. may transfer some to Ukraine. We don't know. We don't know. However inappropriate it may be, they may send it because at some point it may be the only thing they have left to send. This is from Defense One. This is from 2016. Saudi losses in Yemen war exposed by U.S. tank deal. And it says the U.S. State Department and Pentagon Tuesday okayed a $1.2 billion sale of 153 Abrams tanks to Saudi Arabia Tuesday. But that's not the real news. Turns out 20 of those tanks, made in America by General Dynamics Land Systems, are battle damage replacements for Saudi tanks lost in combat. Even though the formal announcement of the sales does not say where the tanks were fighting, the Saudi military is believed to have lost some of its 400-plus Abrams tanks in Yemen, where it is fighting Iranian-backed Houthi separatists. So again, we have these Western main battle tanks being destroyed on the battlefield going up against irregular forces. In each case, these are irregular forces. These are not modern, well-organized, standing armed forces. These are irregular forces destroying these Western main battle tanks. Now, here's one about Israel's Merkava, which is also one of these legendary main battle tanks that are supposed to be nearly invincible. This is what this article from Haaretz says. Hezbollah anti-tank fire causing most Israeli Defense Forces casualties in Lebanon. The most casualties. The majority of Israel Defense Forces ground troops casualties, both infantry and armored, were the result of special anti-tank units of Hezbollah, according to intelligence sources. The Hezbollah anti-tank teams use a new and particularly potent version of the Russian-made RPG, rocket-propelled grenade, the RPG-29 that has been sold by Moscow to the Syrians and then transferred to the Shia organization. The RPG-29's penetrating power comes from its tandem warhead, and a number of occasions has managed to get through the massive armor of the Merkava tanks. Now, the most important phrase here is sold by Moscow. Moscow is selling these weapons to their allies. Their allies are using them on the battlefield against Western main battle tanks, and they are defeating Western main battle tanks. As a matter of fact, Israel's incursion into Lebanon was stopped because of this, because of heavy losses, because of these anti-tank weapons and Hezbollah fighters using them effectively. And these are main battle tanks being used by some of the most well-trained troops in the world. I mean, US troops, Turkish troops, Israeli troops. You don't have to like what they're doing geopolitically or on the battlefield, but you cannot deny that they are well-trained. They are well-trained. They are well-organized. They are well-equipped. And yet this is happening to them. And in each case, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, the United States, they're operating these tanks as part of combined arms warfare. They have infantry fighting vehicles. They have all kinds of support on the ground, artillery. They have air power. They have everything that an armed force should have on the battlefield, and yet this is still happening to their tanks. Now let's imagine these effective anti-tank weapons that Russia makes being in actual Russian hands on a battlefield where Russian forces have an advantage in terms of the number of armor, the number of artillery. They have their entire air force at their disposal. They have all of these long-range missiles at their disposal, cruise missiles, Garan 2 drones. They have all of these weapon systems, and you are going to transfer these main battle tanks to Ukrainian forces who will never be trained well enough to operate them effectively on the battlefield. They cannot sustain, arm, and maintain them on the battlefield the same way Western forces could. And they're going to be going into battle without air cover and with insufficient artillery support and with insufficient support from other infantry. What do you think is going to happen to these main battle tanks? It is a catastrophe in the making. Now, we've been here before. We've heard all of the claims being made about the M777 155 millimeter howitzer that the US sent to Ukraine. They sent several NATO nations sent various self-propelled howitzers. The HIMARS, we're told the HIMARS turned the tide and made the Kherson and Kharkov offensives possible. But as I've explained, the momentum for those offensives stopped dead in their tracks long ago, and they lost brigades worth of men trying to take that territory. Well, they did. They successfully took that territory, but they trained multiple brigades to do so. So is that really turning the tide? And now, I'm telling you right now that Ukraine is losing ground around Bakhmut, and they are very close to losing Soledar entirely because their forces are stretched thin. Their forces are stretched thin because of these offensives, the high cost they paid for these offensives. They traded their army in for territory in the middle of a war of attrition. The worst, absolute worst thing that you can do. In reality, All sending these main battle tanks to Ukraine is going to do is prolong the conflict, get more Ukrainians killed, more thoroughly destroy Ukraine as a nation state, whatever is left of it. And this is because the West does not know how to stop. They are going to continue escalating. They're going to continue investing and doubling down on what they're doing, just like they did in Iraq, just like they did in Afghanistan, just like they did in Syria. And in all of these places, they have failed. I highly doubt that Ukraine is going to be the first place they succeed. But we'll just have to wait and see. While we're watching this conflict be prolonged even further by the West, by sending these main battle tanks, we have to ask ourselves, why? Why? Is it to preserve Ukraine's sovereignty, or is it to maintain Ukraine as a national security threat to Russia right on its border? And the easiest way to figure this out, to answer this question, why are we prolonging this conflict? Is it right to prolong this conflict? All you have to do is flip the script and ask yourself, if it was Russia overthrowing a government in, say, Canada, right on America's border, we saw Russian politicians in the streets, on stage with the opposition in the middle of violent protests. We saw members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wandering in the streets, handing out cookies to the protesters. They installed a client regime that answers to Moscow into power. And then they begin changing the laws, eliminating the opposition, shutting down opposition media, and ensuring that the very worst elements in Canadian society were put up at the top. Voices of reason marginalized or shut down entirely. And then the Russian military just comes into Canada to begin training the Canadian military, bringing in Russian weapons to arm them, and all to prepare for an eventual armed conflict with the United States. Would the U.S. put up with that right on their border? The answer is absolutely not. They wouldn't put up with that, not for a moment. We already look at Russiagate, which was a complete fabrication, and we look at what the U.S. has done to Russia in the midst of an entirely fabricated incident. Imagine if Russia was really doing that in Canada, right on America's border. So this is what the U.S. has actually done to Russia in Ukraine. They have done all of these things. I was showing you the headlines on the screen, and those headlines, the articles will be in the video description below. You could go and see for yourself. This is the Western media admitting this. This isn't the Russian media making claims. This is what the Western media admits that the U.S. and its allies have been doing in Ukraine from 2014 onwards. So this is not about arming Ukraine to defend their sovereignty. They lost their sovereignty in 2014. They cannot fight the Russians to regain their sovereignty because Russia is not the one who took it from them. It was the United States. And if Ukraine wants its sovereignty back, it has to take it back from the United States who took it. That is reality, and that is what we have to remind ourselves every time we see the West escalate further this already very regrettable conflict. We'll have to keep an eye on all of this. We'll have to keep an eye on Soledar and Bakhmut. There's also Kremenna, which is further up north. It's between Kharkov and Lugansk. There's fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces there. We'll have to wait and see how and when and how much of all of these Western armored vehicles, how they are sent, trained, how these units are being stood up. We have to really keep a close eye out for NATO troops operating them, because honestly, it is highly implausible that Ukrainians are going to be able to operate them effectively anytime soon. You can train them to drive a tank in 2 or 3 weeks, and to fire the gun, and to move it from point A to point B, but to have them operate effectively on the battlefield and defeat Russian forces, that takes months, and actually longer. And one more point that I forgot to make that I want to reiterate over and over again is that it takes 6 months to train an entry-level tanker. An entry-level tanker is not the entirety of a tank crew. You will have a commander at least who has years of experience operating that tank. And so when you train, now you're going to need 4 men to operate a Leopard 2 because it does not have an autoloader. Who's going to be commanding the tank? Who has experience operating that tank effectively on the battlefield? Where are you getting that type of experience when you put it on the battlefield? And if you don't have that, you are going to pay for it in terms of how effective it is on the battlefield. So these are all things to keep in mind to temper we see a lot of people enthusiastic. We also see a lot of people panicking over this. These are all things to keep in mind to temper these emotions. These are facts. So if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I'm on Telegram. I'm on Twitter. My YouTube videos are automatically uploaded to Odyssey and Rumble. They might take a day or two to show up, but they will. Subtitles for my YouTube videos are automatically generated. They will show up in a day or two. Thank you for your patience. I know that's important for a lot of people. In the video description below are going to be all of the links that I referenced, and there are some extra ones that I didn't reference, but it is additional information from the Western media supporting all of these things that I've talked about. And there are also ways to help support my work in the video description below. I do not monetize my YouTube videos. If an ad pops up, feel free to either block the ads or to skip them because they don't do me any good. If you want to support my work, you can do that through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. The links to both of those will be in the video description below. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations, month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, I greatly appreciate that. That is what allows me to continue doing this. So thank you again, and as always, thank you for watching.